Perhaps he'll get everyone to agree to make it an international city, a common house of prayer, or some such rubbish. I have a feeling politically correct rhetoric will commonly be mistaken for intelligent thought in these times. One thing I know for sure, Jerusalem will be ground zero for Satan's schemes until the very end.
Behold, I, Yahweh, will make Jerusalem a cup of drunkenness or trembling to all the surrounding peoples when they lay siege against Yehudah and Jerusalem. And it shall happen in that day that I will make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all peoples. All who would heave it away will surely be cut to pieces, though all nations of the earth are gathered against it. Zechariah 12:2 and 3.
Neither the Jews, the Muslims, the UN, nor the Antichrist will know that, of course. To them, it's all negotiable. But here's the rub. The Israelis have been lied to so often by their Muslim neighbors, they don't, or at least they shouldn't, feel they can take any of their promises of peace seriously. With the exception of Egypt and Jordan, none of the surrounding Muslim nations have even formally declared that Israel has a right to exist. And Anwar Sadat, if you'll recall, got himself assassinated for doing that. The 1993 and 1995 Oslo Accords were a dismal failure. Jihad raged unabated. In fact, during the peace years between Oslo I and Oslo II, the number of terrorist attacks rose 745% over the previous decade, a decade in which the first Intifada, or organized Muslim uprising, was in force. Nor do the Jews feel that they can trust the United Nations, or even the United States, not completely. Can't say I blame them. The Israelis, therefore, might welcome some little token of the Muslim sincerity. For example, how about you let us rebuild our temple on Mount Moriah, right next to the Dome of the Rock? We'll all worship our own God in our own way. There's plenty of room up there. What do you say? It's not that the Jews really want a temple. Most of them couldn't care less. But there is nothing that would more convincingly demonstrate the Muslims' commitment to the peace process than giving up their exclusive control to the Temple Mount. Of course, no one remembers that Muhammad declared, "War is deceit." The fact that Muhammad even agreed to abandon the exclusive worship of Allah in exchange for money, political power, and sex in the incident popularly known as the Satanic Verses episode demonstrates the lengths Muslims are willing to go to get what they want. Promise the Jews anything if it'll get them to give us this land and drop their guard. I'll admit I didn't think up the temple thing all by myself. Look again at the end of Daniel 9:27.
But in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering.
For the Levitical sacrifices and offerings to be brought to an end, they have to be going in the first place. And for that to happen, there has to be a temple in Jerusalem. Muslim control of the Jewish Temple Mount is the result of an historical fluke. At the end of the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel's top general, Moshe Dayan, an atheist by the way, turned over control of the Mount to the Muslims as a bribe to ensure their good behavior. So for the Jews to have access to their own Temple Mount would actually be a big step forward for them. For most Jews, though, the temple is not the issue. They've gotten along without one for almost 2,000 years now. The issue, rather, is the refugees. Since the birth of the nation of Israel in 1948, the displaced Palestinian Arabs have been the perennial bargaining chip for the surrounding Muslim nations. For over half a century, they have been demanding that Israel provide a homeland for the Arab refugees, within their 0.2% of the real estate in the Middle East. Never mind the fact that a similar number of Jews were evicted from their homes in Muslim lands upon Israel's declaration of statehood. Right at the outset, we need to clear the air about this. The Arab refugees, as they're called, were created in 1948 by the Muslim armies invading the infant state of Israel when they ordered the Arabs to leave Palestine so they could do a more efficient job of killing Jews. They were told they could come back in a few weeks after the armies of Islam had driven the Israeli infidels into the sea. But the Jews, after offering full citizenship to any Arab who wanted to stay, won that war. And the next one, and the next one, and the next one. Now the Muslims insist that all they want is pre-1967 war borders and restoration of the property the Arabs abandoned in 1948. But if that's so, they need to explain why they waged war on the Jews in 1967. Truth be known, the surrounding Muslim nations have never really been interested in a Palestinian homeland for Arabs and Israel. What they want is a bone of contention, a bargaining chip, a reason to attack Israel again and again, and that issue serves nicely. The Palestinian leadership has proven time and time again they have no interest in governing, except in the role of warlords. As a matter of fact, you can track the frequency of suicide bombings in Israel by looking at the times sanity threatened to break out. Every time a peace overture or political development promises to bring some stability to the Palestinian cause, Hamas or one of the other Islamic fundamentalist groups sends a pair of suicide bombers to the nearest bus stop or nightclub. Unlike the Israelis, peace is the last thing they want. So what would possess the Muslims to sign a peace accord that gave Israel the legal right to exist on planet Earth? One theory is that the Antichrist will get Israel to call their bluff. They will actually accept the land for the promise of peace deal the Muslim nations have insisted for decades they want for the Palestinians. The West Bank, the Gaza Strip, oops, that one's gone already, the Golan Heights, all of it will be turned over to the Muslims in exchange for a spot on the Temple Mount and a solemn promise of peace. I know, it sounds suicidal, but factor in this. Remember what I said about the Arabs who stayed in Israel in 48 being offered full citizenship? Some of them did, of course, and they became the best educated, most prosperous Arabs in the entire Middle East, even though they were, by any standards, second-class citizens in Israel. What the Jews didn't count on was the Muslim birth rate. Even before the first Intifada started in 1987, the Muslim birth rate climbed to 7 or 8 children per household, 4 times that of the Israelis. Do the math. These Arab Israeli citizens will be able to vote the Jewish state out of existence in the Knesset by perhaps 2030 or 2035. So for the Jews, giving away through negotiation what they can't hope to keep anyway may seem to make perfect sense. But if that's true, why would the Muslims make any concessions at all? Because a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. They know that if they have official UN-sanctioned control of the West Bank, they are facing an enemy that is only 9 miles wide at its narrowest point. Secure in the knowledge that they now have the overwhelming military superiority they lacked in 1967, they will make plans to drive to the sea straight through Tel Aviv, where 70% of the Jews in Israel reside, splitting the nation in two. Divide and conquer. Conquer? Wait a minute. What about all the promises of peace? What about the covenant? Oh, didn't I tell you? The Islamic scriptures declare that it's all right for a Muslim to break any treaty he's made with an infidel, if it's in his advantage to do so. In breaking the treaty, they'll merely be following the example of their esteemed Prophet Muhammad, peace be unto him. The broken covenant of Hudbayah set the precedent. It was recorded in the Quran thus: An announcement from Allah and His Messenger to the people on the day of the great pilgrimage is that Allah and His Messenger dissolve treaty obligations with the pagans. Quran 9, verse 3. I'm not guessing, by the way. As we shall see a few chapters down the road, the House of Islam will attack Israel. The ensuing madness will consume a significant part of the world and fulfill significant portions of biblical prophecy. The details are admittedly a matter of conjecture, but the broad outline of this scenario is supported by both Scripture and current events. I should emphasize, however, that this is only one of many possible ways it could all play out. Variations on the theme, any one of which could end up fulfilling the prophecies, are too numerous to count. I don't really want to flog this horse to death, but allow me to demonstrate what I mean. Since a large percentage of the West Bank is already under the administrative, if not military, control of the Palestinian Authority, then it's not beyond the realm of possibility that the Palestinians will be given the West Bank before, and I mean years before, the Antichrist starts having delusions of grandeur. And as I noted, the Gaza Strip is already in Muslim hands. It could happen before the ink is dry on this tome of mine. Well, what then? The scenario shifts. Try this on for size. Since the terrorist activity against Israel and the rest of the world hasn't abated as promised, surprise, surprise, the Antichrist comes in and negotiates the annexation, the absorption of Palestine, the new Arab state carved out of Israel, into Egypt in the south and Syria and or Jordan on the north and east. Makes perfect sense, since the Palestinians were never a separate people anyway, but merely Arabs living in the land that became Israel in 1948. The covenant with many, in exchange for parking a nation with the awesome military might and historic bad attitude of Syria 5 miles from downtown Tel Aviv, gives Israel a world-sanctioned UN peacekeeping force to ensure their security, and the right to rebuild their temple on its traditional site. The Syrian, Jordanian, and Egyptian governments could care less about that little detail, although their imams would have a fit. The deal lets the Antichrist's UN forces swarm all over what's left of Israel, precisely as they did several decades earlier in Lebanon, which suits Israel's neighbors just fine, since there the UN forces served as little more than lackeys for Muslim interests anyway. Ironically, the Palestinians, like the Philistines of old, are history. Well, would you look at that? The horse is still quivering. Let's beat it one more time for old time's sake. A third scenario, the covenant with many, turns out to be either UN Security Council Resolution 181 or 242. 181, if you recall, was the historic partition plan for Palestine that was voted in with a 2/3 majority on November 29, 1947, defining the borders of the soon-to-be sovereign Jewish state of Israel. It gave the Jews the Negev, a hunk of worthless desert south of the Dead Sea, a 6 or 8 mile wide strip running up the coast from halfway between Gaza and Tel Aviv to Haifa, and a similarly anorexic strip of land running down the west bank of the Jordan River near the Sea of Galilee. Jerusalem was supposed to be an international city. Funny thing about UN 181, the Jewish leadership voted for it, but it was rejected, unilaterally declared invalid, by every single Arab UN member state, who invaded Israel a few months later on the day the Jews declared their independence. That was when the peace-loving Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was Yasser Arafat's uncle and a close confidant of Nazi big shots Himmler and Eichmann, I'm told, stated this to his followers exactly as Muhammad had 13 centuries previously. And I quote, "I declare a holy war, my Muslim brothers. Murder the Jews. Murder them all." Unquote. Ironically, though the entire Muslim world rejected UN 181, it is to this day referred to them as the only legitimate borderline for the State of Israel.